Let me start by thanking Dick for inviting me to stand in front of you and talk about Larry. But of course, like everybody else, the person I really have to thank is Larry himself. In some ways, I'm a bit of a fraud here because I was not a PhD student of Larry's. I was never an RA with Larry. I've never co-published a paper with him. But it's been fascinating in the sense of thinking back and preparing this and thinking about this talk to realize there are so many ways in which he has influenced and altered what I've done. And ironically, and I think it's the same with Mel, he's done it in ways that actually you're not aware of, and there is a slight nice irony about that as well, which we can pursue. Okay, I was asked to talk about Larry and his work on amnesia, but I'm going to divert a little bit to begin with, talk about amnesia, and then talk about EBS, and you'll see why. And the reason is because my first interactions with Larry were not to do with amnesia, but were to do with a brain structure called the amygdala. And this is highly significant because Larry's PhD in 1953 was on the amygdala. So this is a brain structure in the medial part of the temporal lobe. And when Larry started work on it, people thought that it might have a role in emotion, and it might have a contributing role to this very bizarre behavioral syndrome called the Kluver-Bucy Syndrome. And he looked at the effects of amygdala lesions in monkeys, and he tried to analyze in a very rigorous way what kinds of cognitive problems might explain the pattern of behavior seen in these animals. He published a series of papers from that. The 1956 paper is the one that most people know. In fact, it's his second most cited paper. And I think I need glasses, actually. It says a lot about how times have moved on. I've just got a quote from it, which says, here we are, it's hypothesis of amygdala dysfunction. The effects of amygdalectomy, that's better, is to make it difficult for animals to identify reinforcing stimuli. That was in 1956. Little did he or I realize just what a huge research area topic the study of the amygdala could become. I started working on my PhD with Dick, and there were very, very few people working on the amygdala at that time. Things are so different now. But that description, although in some senses is wrong, in some sense is actually very accurate and there's a thread in that idea that has run from that time in 1956 right through to current day. And it reflected a long-lasting interest in emotion, which he never stopped being interested in. So I thought you might like to see my copy of his 1956 paper. So for those of us who are PhD students at the time here, we might remember that Larry, for all his great strengths, was a bit on the frugal side when it came to allowances for students. And one of the things that he was, well, we all thought, it wasn't him, it was the university was mean about, was photocopying. So in those days, we used to go to the library, we used to take the book, the journal out, and then, and Nick is here, and he was one of the arch people. The thing to do when you were a PhD student in those days was you had to know where was the cheap photocopier that you could illegally get on and nobody would know that you'd used it. And that there would be like a window between 6:30 and 7 p.m. at a particular photocopier in a particular place that you could use. And I'm afraid that's what we used to do. And that's one of the reasons that coffee at 11 o'clock actually was so important, because we could also work out between ourselves. That was the time to find out where the photocopier was that we could also use. I've jotted it down there, and of course, it's already been mentioned. But I don't know how long the institution lasted as it was in the days when I was a student, as a PhD student here. So I was here from 1976 to 1980. But it was remarkable that everybody in the department stopped, came down, had coffee. Larry was always there, always, and found time to talk to almost everybody there. As head of school, head of department, I don't know how he managed the time. In addition to that, and I've jotted this down just so I didn't want to forget it, so I'd be up on level F, as it was in those days, testing monkeys, and Larry would come in he would come into level F and test at least one monkey a day. So he wouldn't allow people to do research where he wasn't actually physically doing it himself. And he always had a different coloured lab coat to everybody else, for reasons I've never ever worked out. I would never have asked him. I would have been far too nervous. And again, I now look back and I think, how did he find the time to do that? That was just extraordinary. I mean, it's an example that we all should adhere to, but we also all know how incredibly difficult it is to do that. So I carried on working on the amygdala. Larry was my DPhil internal examiner. Sue Iverson was the external examiner. And Larry did one of those things that you dread in PhD exams. He asked simple questions. What you always really want are the very precise, detailed questions, because you can give those detailed answers to them. But he asked the much more difficult conceptual questions and left me floundering. I remember it to this day. Bless him. I carried on working on the amygdala for a few more years. But, and this brings me to his work on amnesia, I then moved to NIH for 3 years. And in fact, Larry was very instrumental in that, but in ways I didn't appreciate at the time. He was great friends with the extraordinary Mort Mishkin. There's Mort being, getting an award from Barack Obama. And with the connivance of Larry and Dick, I was able to go to the States and work for 3 years at NIH. And it was there that I started working on brain systems involved in memory and started thinking properly about amnesia. And I then became much more aware of Larry's extraordinary importance in this area. And of course, to give justice, well, I can't give justice in the few minutes I have, but it's critically important to mention Elizabeth Warrington, because the two of them absolutely dominated UK research in the study of amnesia, and they brought new ideas, challenging ideas, ingenious ways of testing them in ways that were unsurpassed. I'm going to talk about 3 areas of work on amnesia. They're all going to be I'm going to deal with them quite briefly, but they'll give you a flavour of the way in which, if he found something interesting, he couldn't let it go. He had to try and understand it better and know more about it, like any good scientist. So here's the first one, and this is about learning when you don't have explicit memory of what it is you've learned. There has been, or had been, there is, a long history of people thinking that memory consists both of things that you are consciously aware, that you explicitly know what it is that you've learned, but there are other aspects of learning, thereby memory, in which you somehow don't have that same insight into what it is that you've learned. And historically, we can go back to ideas like savings from Ebbinghaus and habit versus memory from William James. Brenda Milner, who of course was a great friend of Larry's, of course published work on HM, this very famous amnesic, who seemingly could remember and learn nothing at all, but then it was realized that there were some things that he could remember. So for example, this visual motor skill of learning to draw the shape of this star, the outline of this star, but the problem was you had to look into a mirror to draw it. So you had to learn to sort of override the visual feedback and draw the star. And in 1962, it was realized that this was extraordinary, but people hadn't appreciated, and took a long time for people to really pick up on the potential significance of this. In 1968, Elizabeth Warrington and Larry published this paper in Nature. It's his 4th most cited paper. New method of testing long-term retention with special reference to amnesic patients. And what he did was take these fragment figures, you can see this one here, or fragment words, and the task was to repeatedly give lists of words that were fragments, and then the fragments built up, and your problem was to say what actually that word was. And because you'd seen the fragments before, the theory was that you would remember some element of it and be able to guess what that word is. And they did it for words, and they did it for pictures. And the critical thing that they noticed was that the amnesics, and these are the black lines here, and performance, and these scores are coming down, these are errors coming down, so as it comes down, performance is getting better. They're not as good as controls, because the controls can actually remember the words explicitly. But they show what we call saving. In other words, they don't start back at the top level each day, they show an improvement across days. Not across days, but from where they were the previous day. And he realized that some element of learning was taking place. We didn't know quite what kind of learning it might be. I'm now going to move on quite a few years. I went to a seminar that he gave. I've said 1979, but that's a guess. There'll be other people in the room who remember it. Nick will certainly remember it. It must have been around then anyway. And it was a sort of game changer. It's not often you go to a seminar and you come away from it going, I see the world in a different way, but it felt like that, I can assure you. And he started the seminar talking about this study by Claparade. I'd never heard of this study before. Larry wasn't the first person to refer back to it, I've since discovered, but I think he was certainly the person who then completely re-energized descriptions of this. So I'll briefly tell you what Claparade described, and then I'll tell you what Larry did. So this is as weird as neurologists come, it has to be said. So for those of you who know the Claparade story, you know exactly what I'm referring to. So he was seeing an amnesic lady, densely amnesic, and for reasons that I'm afraid I've been too lazy to try and pursue or have never been explained, he shook hands with this patient and he had a pin hidden in his hand. And of course, the lady got this unpleasant pinprick. And the critical part of the story was that when he went back to see her, she apparently had no explicit memory of this weird handshake, but she didn't want to shake hands with him, and then said that, well, when trying to explain why she wouldn't shake hands, she'd say, sometimes pins are hidden in people's hands. It's a pretty weird story, and it's a pretty strange thing to do. The critical thing, and Larry saw it immediately, was, hang on a second, we have this gulf between the learning that seems to have taken place and the awareness of what that learning is. Let's see if we can do this properly. We do this experimentally. And that's exactly what he and Elizabeth Warrington did. They used a classical conditioning paradigm in which a tone and a light would come on, and during that time, people would get a puff of air into the eye. It's not painful, it's unpleasant, but it doesn't damage the eye, okay? And what happens is that you become conditioned so that when you hear that combination of the tone and the light, you blink. And the two amnesics that they were testing showed exactly that pattern of learning. They showed classical conditioning. But exactly as in the Claparade patient, the parallels were just extraordinary. One of them, this is verbatim, can you remember what has happened with this equipment here? What were you doing? And he goes, no. I've just forgotten for the moment. It's at the back of my mind. This is classic from an alcoholic Korsakoff patient who will confabulate. But then during the rest of the interval, he said, I had a weak right eye because someone had once blown some air into it. Extraordinary parallel with the Claparade story. Now, that in itself would have been, wow, that's amazing. But what was extraordinary, of course, and the thing about the seminar that made it really stand out, was, of course, he immediately saw that this was actually part of a family of phenomena, that there were something akin to what's going on in blindsight. This notion of memory with awareness and memories without awareness, and realizing that one could try and study these and, of course, put them into this much broader picture of what he was really interested in, is this extraordinary analysis of, for example, blindsight. And I do vividly remember that seminar, and I can assure you that there weren't that many seminars. Looking back, how many seminars can I remember from those years? A handful, but that was one I'll never forget. He also, with Elizabeth, published a series of studies about the nature of forgetting in amnesia, and whether it was because people couldn't consolidate the information, didn't go in properly, or whether actually there was a problem at retrieval, that there was competition, and so information couldn't be retrieved. Again, using this fragment stimuli approach, they showed that if you gave people these fragments to look at, and then later tested them, if you primed them, in other words, you gave them a fragment and said, what is that word? and just ask them to guess it. And you see we're back exactly where we were with guessing where your hand should be or guessing where a target should be. Don't do it explicitly, just guess it. They could do this task extraordinarily well. But as soon as it became an explicit test of memory, they couldn't free recall it and they couldn't recognize it. Now, what's interesting is that nowadays we'd look at that and go, well, that's because it's a priming effect, and priming is somewhat different to other aspects of explicit memory. What Larry and Elizabeth were thinking, well, maybe there's a slightly different way we should be thinking about this, and this is to do with the extent to which your retrieval of that information is cued. That the more cueing that you've given the person, the more they can overcome their memory problem. And they pursued this in a whole series of studies. This is a really lovely one, in which you would get people to learn, rote learn, and then after a delay, you'd either ask them to test their recognition by yes-no recognition of those words, or test them by giving them, for example, a prompt, the first 3 letters of that word, and then say, guess the word, come up with the word that you think you saw, but I've given you the first 3 letters. And what they showed was that people with amnesia were remarkably good when given that 3-letter prompt. And they argue that this was because the difficulty they were having was at retrieval, that they had the information, but there was competing information. And when you narrowed down that competition, their performance suddenly looked good. This is another very elegant way in which they pursued that. So it's the same logic, give you a 3-letter prompt for the start of the word, but what they've ingeniously did was take words which the first 3 letters, we call them narrow or wide, in which you can either have words that actually there are very few common English words that have those first 3 letters, or you can have words for which there are actually quite a few common words that have those first 3 letters. And the prediction is very clear that if it's a problem with interference from other candidate answers, that when you have a narrow set of words that fit that bill, the amnesic should benefit from that. And that's exactly what they found. So their performance gets much closer to those of controls when you have this narrow band of alternatives. So they did this exquisite work on consolidation, which I'll come back to in just a second. The third area is on the neuropathology of amnesia, and this is something that actually is very much close to what I personally worked on for many years. In 1979, Mayer, with Elizabeth and Larry, published a truly remarkable paper. So they achieved something that nobody else had ever achieved, and to be honest, since that time, there's still only a handful of studies that have managed to do this. And what they did was they studied 2 amnesic patients very intensively. So we have very detailed workup of their cognitive performance over a whole array of memory and other kinds of tests. So we have really deep profile. And on top of that, because of course they gave their consent, after their death, we have the post-mortem data. So what I should explain is up until 1979, there are lots and lots and lots of studies that describe the post-mortem, in other words, the brains of people who were described as being amnesic, but that's all we knew. Or we have lots of studies where people study the cognitive profile of people with amnesia, but we actually don't really know, didn't know what the brain pathology was. And of course, this is all well, CTs were just coming in then, but this is certainly pre-MRI, etc. And what they pointed out was that there was pathology in 2 particular sites in their 2 cases, and that's a pattern actually that Andrew Mays, who's one of the very few other people who've led a study that's done the same thing, and then Larry Squire's group in America published a couple of studies of this sort, but they're very, very, very few. And they pointed out the couple of structures that stood out. One was the mammillary bodies, that's these structures here, and which I think people who knew about post-mortem studies would have predicted. And the other one is here. This is a nucleus that is adjacent to what's called the medial dorsal nucleus of the thalamus. It's called the peritoneal nucleus. And I have to confess, still to this day, people haven't quite worked out how it may or may not contribute to amnesia. But the mere fact that they realized that the only way forward at the time was to bring these two extraordinarily challenging things together highlights, I think, both his tenacity and the realization that you just had to do it right to get somewhere. Now, I started work on the thalamus, and at that time, there were very few amnesic cases with selective damage in the thalamus. Thalamus, for those who don't know, is sitting here in the middle of the brain. One of the few cases that existed was a gentleman by the name of N.A., who'd had a very bizarre accident. He had spun around on a swivel chair, and someone behind him who was holding well, it was a miniature fencing foil, to be precise. It went up his nose and into his brain and left a tract in his brain. And I have to preface what I say next by the fact that it was assumed that the damage went into a certain part of the thalamus, called the medial dorsal nucleus, and that the pattern of deficits seen in this amnesic contributed to a lengthy story about how amnesia in different parts of the brain presented different profiles, and which those brain structures were responsible. And we'll get back to that in a second. And what Larry did was sit down and go, hang on a second. That just doesn't make sense. Because if you've got, and they reconstructed where this miniature fencing foil went. And yes, it ended up in the thalamus, but it went right through a part of the brain, those mammillary bodies, or in fact, a pathway from them, immediately above. And so he actually made great sense of this case, which had been anomalous for a long time. But this all comes about in an extraordinary chapter. Here we go. On issues and theories of the human amnesic syndrome. Now, Larry, everybody who knows Larry knows that he was a very gentle man. He was extraordinarily modest. He would never berate somebody. However, he had a limit. And the work of a certain American neuroscientist, I think, had pushed him over the threshold. And he wrote this chapter, and it is the most extraordinary, damning, and I have to say, when you read it now, unbelievably prescient critique. For those of you who've never read it and who are interested in memory, go and read it. It's extraordinary. Those of you who know me know that I inadvertently spent decades fighting academically with this man, Larry Squire. So it turns out that, I was very, very sympathetic to what Larry was doing. But many of you in the audience have probably read this quote at the bottom here. But it just shows, once roused to anger, he really could give it. Despite the kinds of evidence just reviewed, loyalty to an unqualified consolidation interpretation seems to be both complacent and stubborn. This is at Larry Squire. It is possible to have a cake and eat it, but not without danger of sticky fingers and dyspepsia. I wish to God I had the confidence to write something like that. Larry was nothing if not whimsical as well, as we all know. And he came striding up to me in a meeting one time and with his views on this great controversy. The great controversy was, how do you spell the word mammillary? Does it have 3 M's or 2 M's? Big, big debate. And Ted Jones, a great anatomist, had written on this. He didn't like Ted Jones' title, and he told me in no uncertain terms that if he had written it, he would have entitled it Dial Double M for Mammillary. And it so typifies Larry, because it's not really a great pun or anything, but it just reflects his sense of humor, and all of you who know him will know exactly what I mean. He would love the fact that actually there's a cartoon called Dial M for Monkey, which is rather cute. I want to finish this overview of his research by reminding you that it's kind of come full circle. So 2017, and I think here we are working on the amygdala. We have a co-author here somewhere. I saw her. Yes. Where he started, of course. And interestingly enough, this paper here, 2012, is on connections to the amygdala. And interestingly enough, they're exactly the same connections in the part of my thesis I described in the monkey from the pulvinar, and decades and decades later, he was writing about them or collaborating with work on them. He never stopped being interested in something. It just never, ever went away. I just want to mention a few ripples in his work, and then I'll mention ebbs. One of them, if you go to Google Images and you type in Larry's name, these are some of the images that crop up, okay? I'll mention them for a couple of reasons. One is to do with false memories. He got very angered by the potential misuse of the way in which people could accidentally or even deliberately implant memories into people and the damage that that could potentially do. And he wrote some papers on this and thought deep and hard about this. And as a true, strict empiricist, he was very upset by the consequences of the misuse of, I'll put inverted commas, some sort of quasi-psychology. Dick's book crops up, not surprisingly. But there's something else, and I'll preface this because I mentioned this to Mel at the break. So just as Larry was very instrumental in Mel going to St Andrews, when I came back from working at NIH, in 1983, for those of you who remember those happy days under Margaret Thatcher, there were no jobs in universities. I mean, there really were none. And it was Larry who said to me, when I was still in the States, he came here and said, I think there's a job going in Durham, and I think you should apply for it. And Pat's here somewhere. I don't know where he is, but he's here somewhere. And it was Pat who interviewed me at Durham, and amazingly enough gave me a job. I have no idea for what reason, given the other competitors. But I have to thank Larry, again, immensely for that. But there's another part to this, which is quite fun, which is that this rather hirsute gentleman here is Bob Kentridge. He appeared in Mel's picture. And just as I am Dick's first ever PhD student, Bob was my first ever PhD student. But Bob, unlike me, ended up publishing with Alan and Larry. So I'm going to finish with just a few minutes talking about EBS. So EBS is the European Brain and Behaviour Society. Larry has the extraordinary distinction of not just being a founder member, but also being the first president. On top of that, he's the only person to be president more than once. As you can see, he was president again in 1995 and 1996. He, of course, along with a number of other people, appreciated, and this comes back to coffee at 11 o'clock, he appreciated the importance of dialogue, talking within, amongst people, interested in common goals, but who get there in different ways, and realized that there should be a society across Europe that brought people together. And this was the European Brain and Behaviour Society. This is the Wikipedia bit about it. Whether it's entirely accurate, we can debate. But as it says, EBS is a scientific society founded in 1968, exchange of information between European scientists. And I have to say, as we all appreciate now more than ever, boy, do we need this. I mean, boy, do we need this. Notable part, it is the oldest neuroscience society in the world. Now, there's a little bit of debate about that. The BNA or BRA, as it was then, might argue about that. EBRO might argue about that as well. I think EBRO has a stronger case. I don't quite know where Wikipedia got that from. But it doesn't really matter. It's been around a good length of time. This is the bit I like best. Notable past presidents, and Larry comes right at the top of the list. And I'm sure all of you in neuroscience will recognize all these other names: Giacomo Rizzolatti, Mark Genero, Barry Everett. I'd like to point out a mild bit of chagrin here, because as a past president, my name is not there. I feel this is really unjust. And it's its 50th anniversary year. And we're having a symposium at Fens, and I've been asked to give a talk there, and I promise that I will make it and remind people the importance of Larry's role in creating EBS and you know, being an inspiration, and of course reminding them of the importance of it from a UK perspective more than ever. So it's a tribute, it's a thanks for all the memories, and I couldn't resist, simply because it is Larry and because of his appalling sense of humour, that I would say, and thanks for the many Weiskrantz. And thank you all.